special agenda item, RWSS. And James, I guess you should introduce this paper.
Thank you, Chair. I think all councillors are aware of the decision of the Supreme Court from last week and its obvious consequences with respect to the RWSS. So I don't propose to go through that decision at all. Just noting that we currently have existing council resolutions that staff are working to, particularly in respect of the proposed Environment Court declaration on the RWSS consents and the work on the recently adopted condition precedent on environment and the associated River First work program. The paper recommends that in both of these cases that work cease on the basis that the future of the scheme is deeply uncertain and looks less likely than ever before to proceed in the short to medium term, and therefore that we don't incur any further expenditure on those two matters pending further advice from HBRC. HBRC is, of course, the development vehicle for the scheme, and the council has placed the responsibility for advancing the scheme in the hands of the board of directors and management of HBRC. They are both the chairman and the chief executive of HBRC are presently offshore on holiday. They are aware of the decision, but certainly need the opportunity to return home, receive advice from their advisors, and report back to the council.
Who does that is overseas?
The chairman and the chief executive of HBRC, both of those. So what the paper seeks to do is to request from HBRC a report back on where to next with respect to the RWSS, and also advice on what process steps and implications are involved with shelving the scheme indefinitely. And that's on the basis that the prima facie judgment would be that the only viable path at this point for the scheme is legislative reform. The paper does note Public Works Act technically could be an option, but is still highly problematic given the ministerial decision making that's required, the timing issues with respect to that and the general election, uncertainty about ministers that may or may not be in the place of making that decision in the fullness of time, and indeed the issues that it gives rise to for the Minister of Conservation as the landowning minister, who would have to give concurrence to a Public Works Act acquisition, and she would have to weigh up her responsibilities under the Conservation Act, which, while a separate process to that which the Supreme Court ruled on last week, is an additional consideration. So, like, on the basis of all of that, legislation seems like the only pathway forward for the land swap. Look, I spoke to the Director General of Conservation last night. Notwithstanding the fact that the Prime Minister has indicated a view by the government that legislative reform is necessary for the functioning of the management of the conservation estate, it is likely to be some time before that legislative question is resolved, and there's a high degree of uncertainty about parliamentary support for that. So we're looking at, I think, an absolute minimum of 9 months from the present day to when legislation could be changed, and that would be with clear parliamentary support, a considerable will of government to drive it through consultation select committee process. More likely to be 2 years.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems to me that it's impossible to do it in 9 months, James, because you've got an election. You wouldn't start it until the new term of Parliament, and you've then got to draft the legislation and go through 3 readings, and I would have thought even the end of next year is probably a stretch.
So under normal circumstances, yes. That's why I'm saying, look, 9 months would be 3 months from now to get through the election period, and then a 6 month. If a government's of a mind to amend legislation with some urgency and wants to drive it through and has the numbers on a select committee to go for a truncated process, etc., 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 you can get legislation through on on that sort of time frame. It's unusual. It would normally be in the order of 2 years, and I think that's realistically what we're talking about for a complex piece of legislation and a controversial piece of legislation. And even then, it would need to be a priority for the government of the day, and it would need to have clear parliamentary support, all of which is highly uncertain at this point in time. So that's the proposition that's within the paper. More than happy to take questions.
Councillor Bevan.
Yeah, so I've just got one question, James. The joint application that we were looking to make to the Environment Court to seek a declaratory judgment was based around the RWSS in part, but I'm wondering whether there are still matters in your view that even without RWSS we might seek clarification on in regard to Plan Change 6, and whether that should be shelved or modified, or whether it still should involve the environmental groups or certainly not HBRC, but is there some work there that we maybe need to modify but continue with?
There is, and there are several matters around, particularly the way in which the DIN exceeding catchments need management with respect to the consent process that's required from 2020. Our view of those issues is that they are on a longer track. We've got a couple of years before that's a real issue for us to manage, and we would like to come back to the council in a more holistic sense around the whole plan and those issues, because it may well be that we can clarify some of those matters through a plan change process, which may be desirable in light of the fact that the RWSS is unlikely to proceed.
Councillor Wilson.
Just going to the recommendations, Chair, sort of feel a bit cheated here. We were going to get into this river first thing, and before we start it's taken away. Can someone tell me why we would not actually pursue a focus like this? I just think it's a missed opportunity.
So look, the intention is to absolutely continue with a body of work around Plan Change 6 implementation. The key to this recommendation is that we would no longer do that with HBRC. HBRC were looking to incur considerable expense from external advisors. They have no in-house capacity. They have no internal environmental management expertise, so this was going to be outsourced to the likes of Mitchell Dash. They were looking at spending around $250,000 on this work, and obviously the body of it was around the role of the scheme in particularly incentivising land use change for meeting Plan Change 6 outcomes. So on the basis that HBRC doesn't bring anything to the table other than that which we would fund from council to them to some external advisors, and given that the board of HBRC, while having strong commercial expertise, doesn't have environmental regulatory expertise, the governance that we had proposed around that was of a very much a commercial nature, and it was very much in relation to the scheme. So it's my view that the work that we need to do on Plan Change 6 implementation can happen outside of HBRC and outside of that construct. If councillors wanted to brand the work that we are doing in Plan Change 6 implementation around River First, there'd be no problem with that.
Councillor Hewitt.
Thank you. James, a couple of months ago, councillors said to HBRC, you know, this project's all go subject to 5 CPs, and one of the CPs hasn't yet been met, but do you not think this is all a little bit premature, that we're looking to can things when actually we haven't heard from our advisors in HBRC? I mean, The Supreme Court took 4 months to make that decision, and we don't need to make a decision back in 4 days. We need to just take a bit of time here and speak with our advisors, and before we're getting into actually writing stuff off. I note that HBRC is meeting on the 31st, so it's quite likely you're not going to be, of July, you won't be hearing from them before the meeting in 2 weeks' time. I shouldn't imagine to try and pull everyone together is likely problematic, I don't know, but
So, Councillor,
what's the hurry here?
well, look, the intention had been absolutely to seek advice from HBRC, and that's the essence of 2.4. 2.5 is there on the basis that on the balance of all evidence before us, shelving the scheme indefinitely is a probable course that lies ahead. It's not definitely the course ahead, it's the probable course, and therefore seeking advice about the implications of that and the mechanisms around that, in my view, is appropriate at this point in time. The paper does refer to getting those report backs as soon as practicable, and as the paper notes, the significant timing driver we have here is that when we backtrack from the long-term plan to the financial strategy to the capital review, we do need to reach some resolution around the capital that has been allocated for the RWSS within the next few months, and therefore the process to get the views of HBRC, then for the council to consider those that advice, take whatever other advice it may need to do, then take whatever procedural steps are required, such as amendment of the SOI, to wind itself out of the RWSS, will take several months as well. So I'm just very conscious that we are now in the middle of July, and we have the clock ticking, if you like, on our broader financial strategy questions. So there is some urgency, in my view.
So can you then please clarify, there are 2 comments here. One is that staff consider the intent of a land swap precedent was to be through the Supreme Court, but there are other options there. I mean, that CP didn't explicitly say it was to be through the Supreme Court, it said access to the land. So that's an assumption there I'd challenge. And the other one that I'd challenge is that most councillors have previously indicated they would not favour a Public Works Act acquisition. Well, we haven't had that discussion as councillors formally, and it's not something that we can be ruling out on an assumption that's written in here, I wouldn't think.
Look, Councillor, you're absolutely right that there hasn't been a formal position taken with respect to the PWA, although I distinctly recall several discussions around this table, particularly as we were doing the RWSS review and in discussions with the Board of HBRC previously, and it is my view that there was a general feeling across Council that Public Works Act was not the way to go, and the wording in this has been carefully drafted to...
Well, that was in the first instance, though.
Yeah.
Just a supplementary to that particular line, Chair. James, would it be of assistance if we were to include, as part of this motion, an indication to HBRC of the feeling around the council table with regards to the use of the Public Works Act?
Of course, the council cannot formally direct HBRC with respect to the Public Works Act except by amendment to the Statement of Intent, and that of course requires consultation. However, the council is quite free to express its view about the merits or otherwise of that as an opinion for the Board of Directors of HBRC to take into account.
Mr. Moe.
Just in a matter related to that, I understand there was some investigation in terms of storage for the Ngaruroro, which was put on hold because of the work involved with Ruataniwha. So would that be coming to the fore now that the Ruataniwha is slipping back into second place, as it were?
The capital structure review panel has, in their initial discussions, included future water storage in the region as part of their considerations. So, it's very much on the table in terms of the council's financial strategy going forward. There was an allocation, a notional allocation of funding in the long-term plan for a Ngāti scheme. So that's very much live as part of our consideration of the upcoming long-term plan. So it's on the table and reasonably imminently on the table. It's also the subject of discussion right now in the tank group process, and the tank group will be having further discussions about how that fits into a tank plan change over the next few months. So yes, Ngāti is very much on the table.
So just in relation to Councillor Bevan's remarks, the gate was actually locked, so the horse never really got out.
Councillor Curtin.
Mr Chair, firstly a question around the recommendations themselves, and I go to point 2 on page 8. The Environment and Services Committee recommend that council. Can you just explain, James, the implications of these recommendations? Is it a direction now to HBRC, or is it an advice to council for consideration at its next council meeting?
So in formal terms, it's a recommendation to council, and therefore it doesn't officially become a request of council to HBRC until the 26th of July, should those resolutions be adopted. Having said that, it is my expectation that HBRC will be giving due consideration to these matters and reporting back. And I think there are general disciplines on the company in any event, given the significance of this matter to their statement of intent, given to their balance sheet, to their operations, that they would be reporting to their shareholder in a timely manner on the implications of all of this, and I know they're thinking about that as we speak. So I don't think that this work doesn't commence until the 26th of July, although as Councillor Hewitt has pointed out, there is a board meeting planned after the 26th of July. I think we can expect that the Chairman and the Chief Executive of HBRC will be willing and able to attend the council meeting on the 26th. Whether or not they can proffer a definitive view and advice will be very much over to their ability to bring that together, to consult their entire board prior to the 26th, and that's something which we haven't been able to determine at this point.
If I may, Mr Chair, there arises the issue of these recommendations and potential expenditures going in the next few weeks, waiting for that decision of HBRC, in particular the River First scenario, which you indicated the potential to expend $250,000. Should in fact we be sending a clear signal for that not to take place earlier, and therefore giving more imperative to this recommendation and advice to HBRC?
Look again, unless there's a unanimous resolution here today to that effect, you are caught in the situation of really only being able to formally recommend through to the council. But look, I can assure you that in my discussions with the Chief Executive of HBRC, that they have absolutely no intention of incurring any further expenditure. Indeed, you would have to say that a decision by the board or the management of HBRC to do so in light of the Supreme Court decision would be again their fiduciary responsibilities to the company and to the shareholders. So I don't think there's any great risk there of anybody spending any more money on this at this point in time.
Mr Chair, based on that, I'm happy to move the recommendation.
Well, let's note that that's your
I've got a
intention.
question.
And then let's go to first of more questions. Councillor Barker.
Could I just, I sense that people are being a bit cautious about this, but what is ambiguous about the Supreme Court's decision that precludes a land swap? A land swap necessary for the land to be available for flooding that's envisaged by the Ruataniwha water storage scheme. What is there that's it's ambiguous about this? I think this is pretty clear. Why should we expect to have to wait a long time for people to tell us what is now a self-evident truth?
Councillor, the Hawke's Bay Regional Investment Company is an arm's length company. You have delegated the development of the scheme to the company and to the board of directors. it's necessary for you to consult them prior to issuing them with a direction by way of an amendment to the statement of intent. We're simply doing within this paper is setting that in motion, recognising those necessary process steps. But look, I think it's perfectly self-evident to everybody that the progression of the RWSS now is extraordinarily difficult. And really legislative reform, as I said at the outset, is the only option. Now, it's my expectation that HBRC will come back confirming that that is the case, and therefore one of the prospects they may put before the council is a view that the council could choose to maintain its allocation of capital and to continue to wait for the prospect of legislative reform. Now that would be that comes with a whole balance of risks, if you like, and uncertainties, and it may well be the board of directors' view that that's not a prudent course for the company, but we're just not prejudging that at this point in time until they've had the opportunity to form their own position.
Well, what I'm trying to get to is that I think we should have every expectation that HBRC will present itself at the next meeting with a clear statement of position. None of this should have come to them as a surprise. If it does, they should all go. This is an option that's clearly on the table, and they should have thought through what all the consequences were and come here and be prepared to tell us exactly what the consequences are and what the plans are for it. I think we should have every expectation they turn up fully briefed, ready to go at the next meeting to tell us what their response is, unambiguously.
Councillor, I expect that this meeting will be viewed by the management and board of HBRC at some point, and that those sentiments will be registered.
Councillor Dick.
Mr Chairman, recommendations 2.4 and 2.5 seems to be a bit of a timing issue there. For instance, 2.5 says, or requires a council to amend the HBRC statement of intent should council as a shareholder resolve to direct HBRC to shelve the scheme. Do you mean there should council hypothetically resolved to direct HBRC?
Well, certainly the use of the word should was intended to be a hypothetical scenario. The idea here is that rather than doing this in a two-step process, if the advice in 2.4 is that the scheme should be shelved indefinitely, we also have parallel advice arriving at the same time about the mechanism and the implications of doing that, so that a decision can be made in a timely manner.
Okay. And will they understand that?
I believe so, yes.
Are there any other questions? So are we ready then to turn to Councillor Curtin's motion? Councillor Curtin, would you repeat your motion?
Oh, Mr. Chair, I move. Mr. Chair, I move that we adopt recommendations 1 and 2, being 2.1 to 2.5.
Second?
Yeah, I'm happy to second, Chair, and I seek the permission of Councillor Curtin as mover to add an extra clause in 2, which would become a new point 2.4 and would read as follows: confirms the view that HBRC would not support obtaining the dock exchange land by compulsory acquisition.
Well, I'd be happy to accept that adjustment and add or any other mechanism.
So come 2.6. I think it's a step too far. I just think let's be specific about the land swap.
Okay, fine.
So I'll read that to you again. Confirms the view that HBRC would not support obtaining the dock exchange land by compulsory acquisition.
Perfect.
Sorry?
So that's a 2.6, is it?
Well, I was suggesting 2.4, but I'm happy for it to be 2.6. It doesn't really
in
matter.
addition, isn't it?
Make it a 2.6.
Yep.
So have you got that, Leanne?
Chair, will you take this motion separately?
Please.
Pardon?
Please.
Will you take the motion separately?
Sure. So are we ready? Councillor Curtin, we'd like to speak to your motion.
Yes, I would, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to say this, that the dam is dead. There's no doubt about that. As Councillor Barker so eloquently pointed out, there is nothing ambiguous about where the Supreme Court has landed. And we can rail against that, we can look for other scenarios, but the reality is it's all over. And these recommendations simply are a procedural process whereby we're getting the response, as we're required to do, back from HBRC as to any recommendations they may have. Despite that process, HBRC need to be under no illusions whatsoever that there are no circumstances that we foresee at this point in time that would encourage the council to pursue the dam project as is. It deserves to be shelved to at least preserve the intellectual property that is invested in the dam, some $20 million, a huge amount of money, a huge capital resource for the council, so at least we owe it to ratepayers to ensure that that possibility is on the shelf. But the reality is that the dam is dead. Mr. Chair, I certainly endorse the addition promoted by Councillor Bevan that we want to confirm with HBRC, give them a very clear steer that we will not entertain a Works Act acquisition as may have been promulgated. It's simply not tenable in the public mind around this. We would be foolish to do that. What we now need to do is turn our minds to the very significant problems that emerge for council and the challenges we face in implementing Plan Change 6. For those opponents of the dam, that reality doesn't go away. We have a huge challenge in front of us to reach those standards set out in Plan Change 6. The dam did offer that opportunity to support that, but now that's no longer available. So we need to turn our minds as a council to seeking out the opportunities to protect the environment the way we envisaged. And I look forward to the next few months that we'd start to table a very detailed approach to meeting that challenge. I would add finally, Mr. Chair, of my own view that the Supreme Court decision has changed the rules and changed our outlook, and we need to respond to that. And by that I mean the role that the Capital Review Panel is currently undertaking probably needs a new direction, if you like, from this council itself. And I'm be interested to pursue some sort of caucus by the full council, either in a workshop or whatever, to give a direction to the review panel, given that the investment or terms of reference for that panel was very much aligned to a scenario where the dam RWSS was in train. So we now need to re-reference that. So on that note, Mr. Chair, happy to move the recommendations.
Seconder?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Let's be very clear, for all practical purposes, this project is over. And I feel like we've got a dying beast in front of us that we need to euthanize. The simple fact is, as James has pointed out, it's going to take a minimum of 2 years before we would have legislation that would enable us to take the land under a DOC process, if at all. And in the meantime, we would have to renegotiate the cost of construction. We would have to change the price of the water and recontract a whole bunch of farmers, and we would have to find a new investor mix. So it's in effect a complete new project, and it probably won't even fall under the term of this council if it was ever resurrected. So in my view, the whole thing has received a fatal blow, and we need to face up to that reality. So in my view, and I guess the other thing I should say in regard to the extra recommendation that we're now debating, it's an anathema to me that we could take the land under the Public Works Act or any other compulsory acquisition process when this organisation's mandate is as an environmental organisation, and to take land that has conservation values acknowledged would just be an anathema, and I certainly could never support such a move. And I was absolutely shocked when the previous chair of HBRC came to us 18 months ago and informed us that he'd commenced that process without even consulting with us. It was an outrage when that happened. So my mind now, Chair, is turning to the future and the challenges that we face as a consequence of this. I'm thinking about the residual IP from the $20 million that we've spent to date, and does it have any value? I'm thinking about the $60 million that we have left that we had allocated to this project, and I'm thinking more particularly about the 6% return we were going to get on the $80 million, which we have in our long-term plan. That's 4.8 million annual income that we have to plug in our budgets going forward, and that's going to present a significant challenge to us. We also have to think about Plan Change 6 and the implementation for the Tuki catchment, which is a different beast now looking forward than it was with RWSS there. So we've got some quite significant challenges, and any further resource we spend in this area needs to be spent on looking forward and meeting those challenges.
Anyone else wish to comment? Councillor Bailey?
Thank you, Chair. It's been a long time. It's been a number of years. The people I feel most sorry for in this whole situation are those in Central Hawke's Bay who have had their hopes and dreams almost dashed because of the decision of the Supreme Court. I recommend that to those people that they, and I'm going to reference some popular culture here, that they go and watch the Simpsons episode, Marge Simpson versus the Monorail. They can all do that on YouTube. In that particular episode, Mr. Burns gets fined $3 million for dumping toxic waste. A gentleman called Lyle Langley comes to town and sells the citizens of Springfield a monorail, which they don't need. They didn't really want at the time. They'd much rather have spent the money on more policing. Highly amusing, but a popular culture commentary on what happened here. If I might also paraphrase Winston Churchill, it's not the end, it's merely the beginning of the end. It's it's the end of the beginning, but it's the beginning of the end of the beginning of the end. Because as Councillor Bevins pointed out, we now have to deal with the issues in the Tuki catchment looking forward, which will be a challenge for us and our community, because it's not only the Tuki, but it's all the other catchments in the Hawke's Bay. I too want to make it clear that, in my opinion, we shouldn't be using the Public Works Act or any other means to compulsorily acquire the land. Just so that HBRC is clear about that, because as James said, we're entitled to express an opinion on that. So it's a funny feeling to be here today, making this decision. But the 8,846 people who voted for me here in Napier will appreciate that. Thank you.
Other comments? Councillor Barker.
I think there's some tough things in this. The biggest one starts, from the person who contributed to this council meeting as part of the review group, when she said, doing nothing is not an option. I think we have to have that very clear in our head. This is a decision which has come, and we can not do nothing. So this is going to be a period of incredibly intense activity and thinking, whereas the council now stuck with $20 million of investment stranded. Can't come back anywhere, as I see it, stranded. People can talk about it as having IP, but as anything, it only has value if someone else is going to be prepared to buy it. And I just don't think our chances are good of putting all our IP on Trade Me with a price tag of 20 million on and saying option closes at Friday midnight. Yeah, I don't think we're going to get many bidders. So I think the hard fact is that we've got $20 million worth of ratepayers' money now stranded. Can't be rescued. I can't see us being able to, we can have a look at all the options of going to Parliament and so on, but it is a long, long bet to think that Parliament is going to agree to a change in any meaningful way, which is going to be helpful here. And then there's all the obstacles that are necessary about legal reviews and so on and so on. And then there's public opinion, etc. This is fraud. And I think any reasonable, realistic view is that the dam that this council has put forward is stuck irretrievably in the mud and ain't moving forward. To those who campaigned for give us our dam, well, now's the time to make the move. I'd suggest that they would get their $20 million worth of investment very cheap, and if there are elements who are in Central Hawke's Bay who want their dam, well then they can put their hands up and come along and say, well, we'll take over the consents and go and do what we want with it. But I don't see this council making any move on it at all. The big problem we have is Plan Change 6. I don't think we've really got a head around what this means for us, for the Tukituki River, and the agricultural associated with the Ruataniwha and the lower Tukituki River. We also have a number of other things on our plate, such as the port, its requirement for capital investment and growth. We've got other proposals on the Ngāti Roro. I think this council is in for a pretty torrid 6 months of heavy, deep thinking. And I would counsel us against making any hasty decisions other than to accept and embrace the reality as it stands in front of us. And I hope that we take the advice of, quoting people here today, George Washington, who once said, if I was given 9 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend the first 8 sharpening the axe. And I feel on too many occasions we've picked up the axe and started chopping and later had to decide we needed to sharpen it. I think this is one time where we need to pause, do our thinking, our planning, and make sure we've got this thoroughly thought through before we act.
Any other comments? I'll speak to this. Firstly, simply to make sure that the public record indicates that there are at least 5 councillors, and I think I can safely speak for a 6th one, that this is the end of this project, and the foreshadowing process we're doing here should leave no illusions about it. There is clear majority opposition to using any other means to seize the land needed for this proposition to go forward. We have a long-term planning process that we're about to weigh into, which presents significant opportunities and challenges. Financially, we need to address the implications of not proceeding with this project, which has both income implications, but it also puts $60 million on the table to accomplish other goals of this council that might have, in fact, broader reach and significance than the project that we're ending. Plan Change 6 clearly now will require all the attention that folks have talked about, and we need to get on with that. And so from my standpoint, I'm pleased that the Supreme Court finally came forward when it has, because we do have a very pregnant year ahead of us between now and June 30th of next year to size up where we're headed and what those opportunities might be, and what a fresh set of priorities might look like for the council. So hopefully we will get through the final closure from a due process standpoint with some expeditiousness over the next ideally couple of weeks, but certainly before the next full council meeting, I would presume, and we can move on and begin to take on some of the new challenges that I think hopefully the council will find exciting.
Thanks, Chair. What we're actually voting on here is quite different to what a lot of the speeches have been about. What we are agreeing to is that we've been asked to agree to is that we suspend the work on the Environment Court with the EDS and Fish and Game, that we are discussing Plan Change 6 implementation with the Regional Planning Committee, and that we're awaiting advice from HBRC. So we've had quite a bit of song and dance around a wider discussion here. So just to add my 5 cents to it, the Supreme Court decision, in my opinion, was an absolute tragedy for the people of Central Hawke's Bay, for the wider community, and the Ruataniwha Dam project at large. What it also was it displayed total confusion in the legislation. Out of 9 judges who are the top legal brains in the land, 5 said no and 4 said yes. So immediately the Prime Minister and the Minister for Conservation has come out and said, well, we're going to address this through a law change. So let's just take a pause here and not be reckless, because we've got $20 million on the table, and what we've asked our investment company to do and reconfirmed 2 months ago is to proceed subject to some conditions, and to be laying down any other rules and regulations for our investment company without for this project without actually awaiting the advice from the investment company is purely reckless. In terms of the one of the tools in the toolbox is the Public Works Act acquisition of the land, and that may be something that, in order to preserve the $20 million investment, has to be considered now. It was obviously something of last resort, but to rule it out now is, I think, foolhardy and reckless. So I'm relaxed with the first few recommendations that I just outlined, but I certainly won't be supporting taking one of the tools out of the toolbox and with this project. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would echo Councillor Hewitt's comments, and I must comment on a point that you've just mentioned, and you've said that 6 councillors out of 9 are intending to stop this project. Now, I'm not quite sure how you count your votes before the resolutions have been made, other than if it's been through a process of caucusing and predetermination, and I don't like it.
It's all been said, Chair, and you know, I do tend to agree with a lot of the commentary around the table. That is aimed at these set of recommendations, and happy to support them, other than the last one, on the basis that, you know, our investment company, the people we task with doing the heavy lifting for us, haven't even had a chance to have a chat around this yet. They haven't had any advice back from Department of conversation, conservation, close, and conservation from the Department of Conservation. There you go. And look, let's just not rush into anything too much here, which is what this set of recommendations tell us. So happy to support 2.1 right through to 2.5, absolutely. I am a little bit concerned, the River First, I never got a chance to have a good look at that thing, and I do wonder what great ideas were lurking beneath the surface there. Maybe we'll never know, but it is going to take everyone, all hands to the pump, to make Plan Change 6 work without water storage, full stop. Very, very hard yards. As far as the Public Works Act, I'd like to hear from our company, not them hear from us before they've even met, what their views are. I think the chances of land acquisition are probably remote, based on a range of things outside of our control and outside of their control. But however, if they felt there was a means to an end there, let's at least hear their argument before we say we're going to turn it down. So I can't support the last one, and if you will allow that to be taken separately, Chair, I'd appreciate that.
Because I was challenged directly by Councillor Dick, let me just indicate that I communicate daily, in most days, several times a day, with Councillor Graham, who is the sixth councillor that I referred to. But even if I didn't, Councillor Graham has made very, very, very clear prior to this court decision what his view was on this matter. And one would have to be awfully tone deaf to not understand where he was coming from, and then to observe what councillors have said here today and conclude that there were clearly 6 councillors who are not keen on proceeding with this project. So I'll let it stand at that. Would you like to sum up, Councillor Curtin?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And in summing up, I take points made by a number of my colleagues, and Councillor Hewitt's comment around this being a tragedy is certainly one of those that resonates with me. This is now a tragedy, a $20 million one for the ratepayer, and also leaving us with a plan change that we'll be challenged to implement. I think it's worth saying that staff involved over a very long time with a greater deal of investment were extremely well served in terms of the technical engineering development work around the dam, and Graham Hansen is here and I'd like to thank him for his superb efforts in that regard. I think the area and the fatality arises, and a comment made, and I can't quite remember by which colleague, but one that the chief executive in fact said there was a limited amount of environmental capacity within HBRC, and at the end of the day, in my view, is that was the fatality in this and the tragedy in that. There was superb work done engineering-wise, but over that period of time, the ball was dropped, and as a consequence, we are where we are today. I pick up on a comment made by Councillor Bevan in regard to the current state of HBRC, and he referenced euthanasia, and I think that's quite appropriate. We ought to be thinking about taking the horse out and shooting it, but there's one thing I think we need to take the saddle off before we do so, and I think the best piece of work that I saw was River First, so I'm hoping the Chief Executive can take that saddle off the horse and bring it in-house, and we can run with that and create a new horse, but not the current one. HBRC is no longer the vehicle that we ought to be going forward with, and I say that because I believe the public perception of HBRC is such that we cannot go forward on that horse. Ditto, Mr. Chair, we need to change the perceptions of the public around it, so therefore that's why I'm suggesting part of our work over the next few months will be in fact to create a new vehicle to do the things we want to do in terms of the environment. but definitely including that environmental input.
Okay.
I think you can take all of
Lastly, is 2.6, which relates to the buzzwords or other mandatory procedure for land. Do we have it?
Should we see it in your brain? Need to see it in your brain before you find what you want to do. You should get outside the fences. This is about standing orders. This is an intergenerational change, Councillor. No, it's about what happens here.
So there's the point 6. All those in favor of point 6, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
No.
No division. Councillor, you would like to do? All those in favor, raise your hand. And those opposed? Motion carries. Both motions carry.
Because someone has 2 hands up, doesn't mean that's been the case. Sometimes you're on this ground.
Sorry. We're going to move to agenda item 10 because we have a guest with us and we'd like him to be able to get on with his life. So we're going to be discussing climate change adaptation. This is Dr. Sean Weaver, who will be appropriately introduced, and then we'll go back. We'll get that in. I'm not, are we set for motion? Yeah, okay. And then we'll after that we'll go back to agenda item 8.
Yep, absolutely. Just present from there.
Yeah, are you going to introduce or?
Let's get Michelle probably.
Okay.
So Nathan, are you the ringleader here?
Yes, I am.
Oh, that's okay. Go for it.
Morning, everybody. Look, I'd just like to firstly introduce Dr. Sean Weaver. Sean's leading the charge very much in the climate change review, which you're just about to hear about. I would like to also apologise on behalf of Electra Kelleher and Dr. Nick Craddock-Henry, who are coming up to talk about the Slalmek project that I'll give you a bit of a summary on at the end. They've both been held up with transportation and flights and that sort of stuff, so they're not able to come today.
Okay.
Look, I will leave it up to Sean. I will basically just be saying the same things that he will, so Sean, I'll
Okay,
take it
thank
from
you. Thank you, Nathan.
I'll fill in the gaps at the end.
Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
Chairman and councillors, thank you very much for having me here. My name's Sean Weaver. I'm an environmental financing consultant with a specialism in performance-based and market-based mechanisms for environmental protection, sustainable land management. I work in the forest sector mostly, but not solely, and I work in carbon markets in New Zealand and internationally, and also do some work further afield in non-carbon payments for environmental services. So it's essentially a market-based approach to looking after the place and finding win-wins in environmental protection and sustainable development and economic development and prosperity. So,
Put up that bottom.
What do I do?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That one there, is it?
Yep.
Great. So I've been invited to help prepare a draft of a long-term plan element relating to climate change for Hawke's Bay Regional Council. Climate change is work that the council is already doing, but at the moment and up until now hasn't been brought together under a single umbrella. And so the plan or the intention is to bring the different climate change threads together into one coherent storyline in the context of the next long-term plan. So the structure of approaching this is to take into account the response measures the council needs to take and is taking, establish some performance measurement criteria so that progress that's being made can be evaluated against something. Undertake a stock take of existing activities, so it helps us understand where there may be gaps in some of those activities, so that we can set an agenda for action, a strategy to implement that, which will include how that might be financed, and also a process of evaluating how things are going so things can be adjusted through time. In terms of scope, the task has been defined as focusing primarily on Hawke's Bay Regional Council assets and also services, but with a wider community included there as well. But the core is really to focus on the council and its assets and services, and explore risks and opportunities in this whole arena of climate change. The key themes that this is focusing on are the two main areas of climate change response measure. On the one hand, there is adapting to a changing climate, so that's understanding the climate projections globally, nationally, and also as understood regionally. So responding to that and making prudent planning and investments to adapt to a changing climate is part of this equation. And also reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which in the climate change language is called climate change mitigation. And the approach is to focus on synergies between those two where possible, and also synergies with what the council is doing in other areas, and to adopt a no regrets approach where things that one would pursue, one might sensibly pursue anyway, but they happen to be good for dealing with this climate change theme. So, for example...
Excuse me, are you
yes.
happy to take questions as you...
Yeah, sure. Very happy to.
So, just an overriding question. Have you sat down with our staff and worked out what your targets are?
That's a process that we're pursuing. I should have also introduced this by saying this is a process that's just essentially begun, and we're in process of doing that. So I've been here. I came up only about a month ago, started talking to staff on the phone. I don't live here, I live in the South Island, and we're going to have a meeting this afternoon with some key staff. I've had consultations with staff over the last few weeks, and that will continue because, of course, the staff have got expertise in what's already going on, and it would be foolish to try and reinvent a perfectly good wheel. And bring staff together to see where there may also be synergies between different programs operating in the council.
And are you talking like internally?
Yes.
With our staff rather than externally the things we're doing in other areas?
Yeah, no, just internally. It's just with the staff.
So Councillor, it might be helpful to remind all councillors that we actually have a required action in our long-term plan and associated budget of $20,000 per annum to prepare a report for council on options and opportunities around climate change adaptation mitigation. That's work that hasn't been well progressed, and it's something that I've just asked Sean to come in and help us progress. And so the intention in developing that required action, as I understand it when the last LTP was done, was to set us up for the next LTP and to provide a base of information, if you like, around those options and opportunities. So everything that Sean's working up will come to you in the workshopping that we'll be doing over the coming months in developing the long-term plan.
Sean, in his consultation with our staff, considered beaming in via electrons rather than coming in and a carbon producing
And
gas.
Both.
Yes, absolutely.
I tried to bike across the Cook Strait, but I didn't. It wasn't a very good result.
I think it would be correct, Sean, that ECOS probably offsets all of its carbon emissions of its operations.
As part of the, I guess, an intro, I'm a carbon geek, and I develop carbon projects, forest carbon projects in New Zealand and the Pacific Islands, and part of what I do is essentially carbon offsetting and carbon neutrality shop. So I'm kind of deeply embedded in that whole sector. Yeah, and also I also want to point out that I don't have any misgivings about the fact that we produce emissions. The fact that we produce emissions isn't the problem any more than the fact that a forest produces emissions. The issue is what's happening in the overall balance, the overarching balance. You produce emissions and you also take carbon out of the atmosphere. It's the net result that's the issue, and I suppose that's the challenge that we have. And I certainly steer away from having any problem with using fossil fuels because we use them. How long that'll happen in terms of decadal timeframes is another matter, even just on the point of view of energy pricing. But going to the, I know. So challenge of climate change adaptation. A warming climate is forecast, in the long-range forecast, is likely to be drier. On average, the soil is likely to be drier, it's going to be stormier, so that when we get rainfall events, we're likely to get more intense rainfall events, which is going to pose challenges to things like flooding. We've got sea levels that are rising. I don't want to go in too much detail about this, but just in general, there's going to be a number of risks that face council and services and the regional economy resulting from these trends. An increasing risk of pests and weeds, increasing risk of drought in terms of intensity and longevity of drought, which is obviously a threat to farming and water supply. Flooding challenges and the intensity of flood events and the cost of living with those flood events is of relevance here, and of course also coastal erosion in response to a combination of sea level rise combined with storm events that are just packing a bigger punch. So it's like going into a ring boxing against a heavyweight instead of a welterweight. So responding to this to reduce exposure to risk, there's a need to invest in infrastructure, and that includes engineering infrastructure, ecological infrastructure, and policy and planning for adapting to climate change. So, for example, engineering infrastructure in the region is right in the heart of responding to climate change, and that includes the level of service in the stop bank system and the water schemes in response to the scale of flood events that need to be responded to, as well as coastal changes as well. Ecological infrastructure is the ecosystem services that are delivered by ecosystems that provide a range of beneficial services, including things like water supply and water quality, flood protection, erosion control, and drought mitigation. And then we have things like policy and planning for adaptive change. The long-term plan is part of that equation, with the climate change focus for the next one, to review and update levels of service for infrastructure, which is already being done by council, and also looking at the associated investment cycles for that infrastructure. Also supporting the agricultural community in coping with changing weed and pest populations. In terms of reducing emissions, the things to look at in terms of risk, the long range and medium range effects of things like energy pricing and carbon pricing on council assets and services. I've got a graph there of New Zealand's actual and projected gross and net emissions between 1990 and 2030, and the take-home message there is that the tea leaves suggest the carbon price is going to go up because there's going to be our net emissions aren't going to be in such a favourable situation in the next decade as they have been in the last decade, partly because nationally the plantation forest sector is moving to a phase of significant scale harvesting, which it wasn't in that phase up until now, and that will mean that nationally the ability for the country to offset its energy emissions through the forest sector will diminish, and that's likely to push carbon prices up, which in turn will affect energy prices.
Sorry, the green bit, when it goes up, is that net?
Yeah, the green is when you include forest sector emissions, and up until now, the green net emissions have been below gross emissions. Gross emissions is the blue line, which is essentially the energy sector emissions, fossil fuel emissions, and the net position has been below that because of the help that the forest sector has given to the nation. But you'll see around about now that's crossing over and moving into a situation where the green line is above the blue line, and that means we don't have the same level of essentially offsetting service from the forest sector. So that's because of harvesting. And so the period between now and 2030 is going to be a much more challenging period for New Zealand climate change policy and meeting its obligations under the Paris Agreement. And as I say, when that will also mean that the supply of carbon offsets or carbon credits in the system won't be so plentiful, so that will drive the price up.
Thanks for explaining that, because I was reading it the other way.
Okay, cool. So New Zealand is a signatory to the Paris Agreement and took on a nationally determined contribution. In the previous phase, New Zealand took on a position under the Kyoto Protocol, which had an emissions reduction target. This has been modified into the Paris Agreement, but it's essentially a national target. And the suggestion here is to look at, you could have a regionally determined contribution as a way of a region making a contribution to the nation's goal to reduce emissions. And also reduce the region's risk exposure to energy and carbon pricing in the same manner through forms of local government leadership and things like maximising carbon credit exports from the region from reforestation in Hawke's Bay. The erosion-prone landscapes in Hawke's Bay are making a significant contribution to sedimentation in waterways and the management of forestry, and that combination with flood events and high rainfall events is leading to infrastructure risks downstream with forestry slash. So there's an important consideration there to try and reforest erosion-prone farmland and marginal farmland, which can be, those portions of farms potentially can be turned into carbon farms and also honey farms. But that would enable the region to export carbon credits to other parts of the country. There's opportunities to enhance energy efficiency programs in council assets and services, potentially enhance transit-oriented planning and design and integrating that with other local government and organisations in the region, and thinking like vehicle transport between Napier and Hastings, and the congestion on the roadways and ways to address both congestion and emissions at the same time. Fleet management for the council to reduce emissions and move towards, for example, electric vehicles when and where that is financially sensible. And also looking at things like carbon neutrality, leadership by the council and support for carbon neutrality of other organisations in the region. In reforestation and carbon the role of carbon financing in reforestation. There's a great opportunity for economies of scale in this for the Hawke's Bay to have a coordinated approach to taking advantage of carbon price, to co-finance getting trees back on the landscape in places in around the region where it would be better to have them on there.
The question, maybe this would come up again in the next part of this, but my understanding is in Australia, for example, that there are projects underway to rebuild soil carbon and actually then trade carbon credits off of that. Is that something that you think we should look at here?
Well, I'm not sure that you can trade soil carbon under the New Zealand's under the Paris Agreement in the way that New Zealand signed up to that. Certainly wasn't an option under the Kyoto Protocol. So it was just left out of the carbon accounting boundary. Whether or not you could do that under the Paris Agreement perhaps is something worth clarifying, potentially. The trouble with the Paris Agreement from a carbon point of view is there's a lot of detail hasn't been thrashed out, and those details are still developing. Yeah.
Leaving that aspect of it aside, the underlying point of if we had aspirations for improving farming practices across a range of issues here in Hawke's Bay, enhancing soil carbon is a plus.
Yep.
And potentially it might lead to an economic benefit. Is that a fair statement?
Potentially, yeah. Whether or not you could carbon finance it is a question that I can't answer just at this point in time, but there would be co-benefits anyway. But it's worth looking into.
So, look, I could comment that the New Zealand government gave long consideration to this in the negotiations around the Kyoto Protocol. And one of the issues for New Zealand is our very problem that we have in Hawke's Bay is that we lose a lot of soil. And so if we took on an obligation that gave credit where soils are growing, we also have to take on the obligation to account for losses where we're losing them. And so it's a double-edged sword for a region such as ours. At the national level, it's broadly netted off because we have areas like the Waikato, for example, or Taranaki, where you've got low levels of soil erosion and soil accumulation happening through high organic matter in those soils, and then places like the East Coast where we're losing it. So there are regional differences, if you like, but it's an area that I think is part of our work with land managers, that soil health and soil conservation more broadly is a co-benefit of work in this area.
Yeah, I was just going to add too, I was involved in a number of those projects in Australia, and the greater challenge that we had was actually quantifying the amount of soil carbon across the landscape, because it is so variable, and if you're taking a small core, it's just not representative of the wider picture. And so there's a range of technologies being developed to remotely sense this information, which I think will enable us to make better predictions on changes on the soil carbon mass balance. I do agree with James. The other risk is that soil carbon can be lost far more rapidly than it can be accumulated, and how we mitigate that is a major challenge.
So so there's opportunities, certainly in the forest sector, for generating economies of scale in harvesting carbon revenues into the region by being a net exporter of carbon credits from erosion-prone hill country, which becomes less so. So of course there's co-benefits for erosion control. In a sense, foreign exchange with respect to the region's economy to finance that. Also co-benefits to help co-finance a growing Manukahani sector in the region. Another area that is worth considering is carbon neutrality, and as part of the preparation work I've been doing for this project is to calculate the carbon footprint for Dalton Street premises of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council. And so there's the 2015 and 2016 calendar year carbon footprint. The only parts of that footprint that are not yet calculated are, I've got the data but I haven't finished the calculations, are for waste and freight, but that shows you that the bottom line is in the order of magnitude of about 450 tonnes of carbon annually emitted. And so that's essentially the carbon footprint for Dalton Street. As I say, it'll go up a little bit when waste and freight is taken into account, but that won't be a big portion of the footprint. The biggest portion of the footprint is diesel, and flights are also a big portion. But if you wanted to be carbon neutral, you could buy carbon offsets to match that carbon footprint. So you'd need to buy 440 tonnes of carbon credits, and if you're going to buy them at $18 a tonne, which is about the going rate of NZU forestry units at the moment, then that will cost you $8,000 to be a carbon neutral Dalton Street, for example.
Why would we buy them when we're producing far more, when we're sequestering far more than that in our other portfolio?
You could buy them. Well, I'll come to that. I want to elaborate on this topic about being a buyer and a seller. I want to also introduce this term of insetting. Carbon offsetting is when you have a carbon footprint. You draw a boundary around your business, and then you determine within that carbon accounting boundary your annual net emissions, which is predominantly going to be fossil fuel emissions. And then if you want to be carbon neutral, your net emissions need to be offset by at least the same volume of carbon credits that you can purchase from outside your business boundary. And so if you bought 441 carbon credits at $18 a tonne, you could assert carbon neutrality. But insetting is when you do essentially the same thing, but inside your business boundary. So, for example, if the Hawke's Bay Regional Council has lands available that either it owned or controlled in some manner where it could do the reforestation and generate those carbon credits, but instead of selling them to somebody, you issue your NZUs, but then you keep them and then you retire them / cancel them, which means that you consume them yourself against your own carbon footprint. And that would be one strategy for being a carbon neutral council without ever having to buy carbon credits. And if the carbon price is forecast to go up in the next 20 years and 30 years, being insulated from that price because you produce your own credits is financially potentially a smart way of operating. It also enables you to directly participate in climate change adaptation and mitigation at the same time, because you're mitigating your emissions by doing a climate change adaptation action, which is reforesting erosion-prone hillsides. You'd only need about 100 hectares of land to do this, because you're producing about 6 tonnes a hectare per year of reforestation with indigenous forest. And to generate 450 tonnes, it would take about 100 hectares. But if you were to make it a bit bigger and use 150 hectares, you can get into a carbon negative situation and model carbon negative business activity in a country like New Zealand, which would be pretty innovative and showing a strong form of leadership, because globally neutralising emissions won't be enough to avoid the worst scenarios for climate change impacts on the global economic system. All models show that the global economy needs to peak in emissions and then head downwards. And modelling that would be one interesting way for a council to show some.
You talked about carbon credits gained from indigenous forest.
Yep.
Is there much difference between indigenous forest and pine forest in terms of the credits generated?
No, I mean, no, they're just a different type of project. So if you're using pine trees as your way of sequestering carbon, they'll grow faster. But if you want to harvest them, then you come up with having a carbon liability when you come to harvest. And you've got to manage that liability at harvest time.
I'm just talking about the annual credits that you get.
The number of credits per year that you'd produce under a pine forest would be more than an indigenous forest, because indigenous forests grow very slowly and they end up getting bigger in terms of their carbon mass after about 200 years. Your pine forests grow much more quickly and then level off more quickly. So you could do either, but if you're going to reforest erosion-prone lands, you might want to, I mean, there's a lot less effort letting nature regrow its own forest than putting trees in the ground yourself. So the cost of doing a project where you close up paddocks and let gorse come back, and then in that gorse you let manuka come through and you harvest the honey during that phase of its life cycle and just let it become a natural forest on its own. There's a lot less cost in producing what eventually is a revegetated landscape. So as I mentioned, the structure here is regional response measures that need to be considered, some performance measurement criteria, a stock take of what the council is already doing, set an agenda for action based on that stock take, look at a strategy for implementation, and evaluate things going forward. The first part of this is work that's being undertaken currently, and with the second part of that set to happen between August and September. So there we go. Happy for some questions.
Thank you, Chair. About 8 or 9 years ago, there was a couple of days, like a think tank deal going on in Wairoa. I think it was 8 years ago, and it was determined at that time that the Wairoa district was in fact carbon negative, meaning it was sequestering more than it was emitting. Do you have any idea what the whole of Hawke's Bay looks like in that space?
No, not off the top of my head, but it wouldn't be terribly difficult to find out because it would be essentially a low resolution carbon accounting exercise using aerial imagery. And taking into consideration that some of the forestry, quite a lot of the plantation forestry, will be a combination of taking carbon out of the atmosphere while it's growing and putting a whole lot back when it's been harvested. So it's about balancing that out. But that's an exercise that could be done, certainly.
That's happening at the moment. That's why I qualified my statement by saying it's 8 or 9 years ago, because they are harvesting.
Yeah.
But I challenge you that regional leadership would be more effective than trying to muck around with 100 tonne in this building.
I guess my assumption was that that's where this project was headed in terms of its long-term plan incarnation. When that's before us, we'll be eventually looking at what would a plan look like if we wanted Hawke's Bay to be perceived as carbon neutral.
So the concentric circles diagram that Sean put up was the project structure, if you like to say. First, we want to look at our own house to make sure we've got our house in order before we start preaching to the rest of the region. And secondly, what are the things we directly influence as a council, and then what are the things more broadly at regional level that we don't necessarily control but can show leadership and work with others on. So there's sort of 3 different components to that, and we're just trying to cover all the bases.
And there's also the point where if you do create carbon credits and sell them, then you can't claim that for your own neutrality because you've sold that ability to make that claim to the buyer. So that's where the exercise needs to take those sorts of things into account.
Councillor Barker, were you?
Well, you've answered some of, when I read this paper, I was frustrated by it because it didn't seem like we were doing much. But what you've told me is that on this 1,000-mile journey, we're here taking the first step.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the case, well then I'll relax a lot more. The thing is that what I don't see in here, a couple of things, just key points. You talk about coastal erosion. Well, I think one of the key things is going to be for this region is going to be coastal inundation. A lot of this part isn't high above sea level, so it's not going to be erosion, it's going to be inundation. The other point here is I think there's lots of opportunities for us to do better, so I don't see that in here while we're tinkering around what we do. I've often thought that we could have had alternative fuels created here. We've got lots of natural things that we could use to create alternative fuels. We're not doing much on that, so I didn't see this in the paper. There's a whole pile of things, but if you're saying this is just a start, well, okay, I'll rest. But I think there's a profusion of things we could and should do, and the opportunities here, in my view, are enormous. And we could have a great selling point for this country, this part of the world, to be not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative, and come and join a place which is entirely sustainable. And so this is, let's get on with that.
Yeah.
Councillor Bevan?
Chair, I had some difficulty understanding the accompanying paper, Nathan, and I want to read a paragraph to you. Working with land managers and other primary sector stakeholders, we will develop an integrated vulnerability assessment for Hawke's Bay, combining regional climate change predictions with impact assessment and providing an evaluation of scenarios for future change. The project uses a comparative case study methodology to explore adaptation options in 2 Hawke's Bay catchments, as well as developing a regional economic model to quantify likely impacts and options at a higher scale. That's gobbledygook. Can you please tell me what you're saying in plain English?
With pleasure. That's not my words, but I will convert that
It's
to...
not my words either.
No, it's look. The project is a sustainable land management and climate change funded, which is through MPI work that's looking at a decision-making process around adaptation and the different pathways you can make or you can take over time if you make a decision and around a climate change related point. In terms of, you come up with a series of indicators from what you know the changes in the climate for the region are going to be. You might put in some trigger points, and at that trigger point, there is the need to make a decision from the perspective of a horticulture sector or a pastoral sector or any other primary sector that we have in the region in terms of being able to deal with the risk associated with that point. And so this is a method for extracting those decisions that need to be made. What are the sort of the binary yes/no implications of that? Using the most up-to-date climate change information that we have to map out what are the risks and what might those risks be sector by sector. It then is to engage a range of the primary sector in the Heratonga Plains in particular, and then in Wairau, Northern Hawke's Bay, to look at, from their perspective, the site-specific risks associated with climate change, and then to work through a process of, well, what are the key risks, what are the decisions we need to make at those times, what are the implications of those. And it is to map out a framework going forward that potentially can be used in planning and policy decision-making.
So have you been out to any of the sectors
No,
and asked them what they're doing?
This is like Sean's work. This has only just started. It started in January, and the work that's gone to date has been collating all the climate change information that exists for Hawke's Bay. It's also been gathering all the information that we hold in terms of the different spatial layers and GIS, and the next phase 2, which was I was meant to talk to them about today, but they haven't made it up, was how we're going to do exactly that, roll it out to the primary sector.
State your concern.
I'm lost. Just begin.
Chairman?
Any, Councillor Dick?
Thanks very much, Dr. Weaver. Just on a slightly different tack, can you give us a 2-minute assessment of the impact of the American withdrawal from Paris Accords?
I think, it's motivated a lot of action elsewhere. At the state level in the United States, for example.
Yes.
There's been, California's the 5th largest economy in the world, and they're saying, well, we're going for it anyway. And in a way, some of the commentaries on the Trump administration's stance on climate change is that they're being a bit quiet on it and ambivalent on it, and kind of letting things just carry on anyway, because he's not attacking it. He's pulled out of Paris, but a lot of domestic stuff in the US is going to continue in terms of innovation. Right. And I wouldn't be surprised if the US doesn't end up performing quite well in terms of emission reductions and a whole range of activities, because the momentum in that country is already quite strong. It's a world leader in many of these areas. So, and in other parts of the world, it's motivating other countries, and it's motivating local governments. See, one of the things about local government is that you can do what you choose to do in terms of voluntary actions that contribute to innovation in this space. And so it gives local government around the world a lot of opportunity to take a leadership role, even if nationally the government might not be as ambitious as some people might like. It gives other voluntary actors an opportunity to step up if they so choose. And especially if it makes economic sense to do so.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Councillor Hewitt.
Thank you. I would just like to go back to the paragraph, Nathan, that Peter read out, and you are doing case studies in the Hiratonga Plains and Wairoa, and I was going to ask, what about Central Hawke's Bay? Because if you go back to the 2011 weather bomb, and it went from pretty much Waimaramouth down to just north of Prongaha, so there's a coastal strip there that's been severely impacted by climate change, arguably, and the opportunities there for reforestation or forestation are huge. So what are the options for that neck of the woods?
Yeah, and agree. The primary motivator here was resourcing and time. They didn't have the capacity to do any more case studies, and it was thought by looking at Northern Hawke's Bay, the same weather bomb had the same impact up there as well, and afforestation is obviously a major tactic for dealing with that. There was a couple of other unique issues associated with Wairoa and Northern Hawke's Bay that they were intrigued about, and so they went with that instead of doing something further south.
Any further comments?
I'm prepared to move the recommendation, Chair.
Thank you. I just would comment that 5 years or so ago, I can recall sitting in the back row here as a onlooker to this council where a debate occurred as to whether climate change should even needed to be referred to in the strategic plan of the day, because the statement was, well, obviously it's a part of everything we do, and so there it sat as an invisible part of everything we do, and nothing got done, and so to me this is a even though it's just toe in the water, this is a quantum leap forward in making explicit a priority that one would argue should be front and center for this council, and hopefully this will lead to a fairly audacious set of goals and aspirations that are put before us. Whether we can tackle them all or not remains to be seen, but to echo Councillor Barker, I mean, to me, this is an area, it's a delight to receive a paper, first of all, and on this subject, that acknowledges that in fact there are a lot of touch points in the activities of this council that have a bearing on this issue and could be managed in a proactive way to stand us in great stead and in a leadership role vis-a-vis other players in our region and elsewhere in the country for that matter. So I just would encourage you to think very as I say, very audaciously as to what you wind up putting in front of us as a set of considerations for us going forward. We have a mover and a seconder discussion, further discussion.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Putting words into my mouth. I'd like to thank you, Sean, for your presentation, and I'd like to thank you, Nathan, for this particular paper. When I read it, I became so overcome with emotion I had to sit down for a little bit. I just thought it was absolutely brilliant because it indicates to me that we're thinking of going in a direction where we really need to go. And for all its bureaucratic gobbledygook, I see the intent of where we intend to go. So I'd like to thank you very much for that, and for James for pulling out that little bit out of the long-term budget and putting this program together. That much appreciated.
Any other comments? Councillor Barker.
I want to thank you for it. I want to echo the Chair's invitation for you to be audacious. And I do so for a couple of reasons. Firstly, in response to the question asked of you by Councillor Dick, the answer is quite simply that Trump is a hoax. That's the issue here. And the climate change is real, and I think we have all the world commentary has greatly underestimated what the actual circumstances, because people are so cautious about the predictions in the face of trenchant criticism by the hoaxers like Trump. I've watched the predictions on sea level rise, and on every occasion the official figure for sea level rise in this country has been upgraded significantly in a shorter time. And I still believe firmly that we haven't got that right yet either. We have had talks about changes in our environment. mass extinctions, all which seem highly improbable until you read the latest reports on what the predictions are for the Great Reef off Australia. You know, it's going, and a whole pile of other things happening. We cannot afford to be timid here at all. The second part about this is that this council has been focused on one major project for quite some time. We've had a discussion today, and I think there's councillors of mine that we've got to move on and do something else. So into this area here, we now have a period as a council, an interregnum, a state of flux, where I think we'll be looking very deeply about what we do. And I hope part of that deep thinking is about the long-term future of this region, which we have influence on, and to be a voice which can say with authority and credibility that things have to change and we're going to do it. So I feel we're in a position to make some significant changes here. What we require is some leadership and bold thinking. We're happy to prune it back if we think you go too far. But I would hope that you feel no restraint on reach and provocative, challenging, and do whatever you can and do it quickly. I think we're up for the conversation.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Put the motion to accept the report. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's break for lunch until 1 o'clock.